Hey, before we get into today's episode, I just want to mention something. You know how other podcasts have like sponsors and they have to read the ads because they're getting money off it? We haven't got any sponsors, but we do want to let you know about a Cordeo event, actually two events that are coming up. So Cordeo is a ministry Mike and I do together. So if you are anywhere within reach of southern England, okay, this is near Chippenham where we're based, on the 10th, 11th, and 12th of April, those 3 days, we've got two Cordeo events. On the Thursday and Friday, the 10th and the 11th of April, we're going to have a small group gathered together studying through the book of Philippians. It's going to be amazing, not because we are, but because Philippians is. And we're really excited about that. And then on Saturday, the 12th, we've got a day where we're going to get a group together and we're going to focus in on the new birth. And so the whole subject of our regeneration, our new birth. We'd love you to join us. So if you're local, presumably it's going to be easier, but you're welcome to fly in. We'd love to have you with us. But it's coming up. You can come for the Thursday, Friday. You can come for the Saturday. You can come for the Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But you would be very, very welcome. So get in touch with us, comment, whatever, communicate with us, and we would love to have you join us. Anyway, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome back to the Biblical Preaching Podcast. My name is Mike, and this is Peter. And today, Peter, on this episode, we're thinking about foundations.
Yes, foundations. I think this is something that we've found more and more in different teaching settings as well as in church, that this is really critical. Like this kind of opens up a whole load of stuff. And so I'm excited to get into this.
So how much are we talking about building?
Yeah, well, I'm known obviously for building and DIY in my circle of friends.
We're both known equally for our lack of
That's right, that's true.
expertise.
So by no means a builder or an architect, but I like the illustration of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Italian famous building. The history of it's fascinating. They started building and very quickly realized that it was leaning. There was an issue. And so apparently the 8th floor of the 8 floors of the bell tower of the cathedral in Pisa, they adjusted it so that one side is, I forget now, 8 inches or something higher than the other side. Kind of logically thinking that, well, we can maybe correct the lean.
Yeah.
Which
protect it from
it's patently ridiculous if you think about it. Like it's leaning already. It's not going to balance it by going the opposite. Maybe we can mock it. It's still there 800 years later.
Yeah.
But it's kind of an illustration that I come back to because I think it's easy for us to think if there's an issue, we can fix it at the high level. So if there's an issue in our church, then there's a sophisticated thing that's going to fix it. If there's an issue in my marriage, there's a sophisticated thought that's going to, bring a breakthrough. Parenting, life, whatever the situation, we tend to think, right, there's something more, if I could just learn something more at the higher levels, then I'm going to be able to find the solution I'm looking for. When the problem with the Leaning Tower of Pisa is always and has always been the foundation. The foundation is not solid, it's shifting. And so I think it's the same in ministry world, in church world, that actually we do well to put energy into the foundational assumptions of our worldview, of our theology. And if we can kind of dig down below the surface and instead of just assuming things, start to question things, and then even better, get biblical answers, biblical understanding of those foundational issues, that's going to help all the way up the tower. And so instead of thinking, right, here's a pastoral situation that's tricky, I'm going to try and find something new to solve it. Instead go, now hang on a minute, what are the foundational assumptions that may be leading us into this problem?
It's true that when sometimes in conversations or in preaching, like you said, we're trying to find something profound to sort of switch on or switch off something in someone's life. But actually, profound means something deep, but we tend to think, well, that means something high level. But actually, what you're saying, what we're suggesting, is that kind of literally go down, foundational, kind of basic, not basic, but kind of the basis of everything.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've written a book called Foundations. We'll mention it again a bit later, but you talk about there being 4 big questions that we should ask but typically don't.
Well, let me kind of flag what they all are.
Mm.
It's nothing profound. I suppose it is technically, but it's not like, whoa, I never thought of that. This is very
Yeah.
kind of common, run of the mill set of questions. In a sense, you'll find them in theology books and so on sometimes. But the basic questions all relate to each other, and it's our answers to them that form the foundation upon which our life, our theology, our worldview, everything is built on it. And the four questions are really simple. First question is God. Who is God, or what is God like? The God question. And that's the most important one. But then what flows from that is our understanding of humans. What does it mean to be a human? And how do humans operate? And then, okay, we're made in the image of God. As Christians, that's our understanding. Great. So why is there a problem? That's the third question. There is a problem. Something is not right. What is it? And of course, as Christians, we know the problem is sin, but okay, what is sin? And then the fourth question, or the fourth assumption is, okay, what's the answer to that problem? So what's the solution to our sin problem? And then again, in Christian world, we might say, oh, it's God's grace. That's the answer. Okay, what's God's grace? And so we kind of want to be kind of scratching at the surface instead of assuming these things and saying, yeah, those are givens. Everyone knows who God is and what it means to be human. Actually go, now hang on a minute, what does the Bible teach? Because as fallen creatures, our assumptions shouldn't be trusted. And so if we can get a biblically informed understanding of those four questions, we're going to be in a better place. Actually, it's not just, I didn't understand, now I've read my Bible, now I do understand. This is kind of a lifelong quest.
Yeah.
Right? We can be studying these questions and improving our answers to them probably for the rest of our lives. And so this isn't, it's simple, but it's not simplistic.
So the first question, the God question. So question number one: what is God like?
We've been lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that when you say God and I say God and this other person says God, we're all talking about the same being.
Yeah.
And for most people in most of the world, for most of history, that would be a bizarre assumption. The moment somebody says God, the response would be, which God are you talking about? Because there's so many options. And it's only really a sort of, I don't know, modern era Christian West, maybe, that sort of assumes that God equals God equals God. But most of the world, certainly for most of history, would say, well, which God are you talking about? And so, yeah, it's really worth wrestling with. Which God do we mean? Because even when we say, well, the Christian God, the next thing we say is going to define something.
Yeah.
And so if the next thing we say is, the one who created everything, the powerful one. Okay, is that true? Yes, it is. Is that a full biblical picture of who he is? Or is that kind of front and centering something about God, but missing other things about him? Yeah. And so, yeah, it's a question we've got to wrestle with.
Yeah.
A.W. Tozer, famous quote, right? A.W. Tozer, in I think The Knowledge of the Holy, said that what comes into a man's mind when he thinks about God is the most important thing about him. And that's really what we're saying, right? When I say God, what do you think? What's your assumption?
So what would we say? So where are we coming from?
I think the more we read the Bible, we as Christians, the more we have to recognize that the God of the Bible is not the same as any God that humans are assuming, right? So in our assumption, we may come up with a solitary, powerful dictator in the sky, or we may come up with a multiplicity kind of God in everything, everything's God, complexity, and everything in between. But no one accidentally comes up with the Trinity, right? So the God who is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, three persons. You get into the theological definitions because you have to define what the Bible's saying. That's what the theology is doing, isn't it? It's saying, well, the Bible doesn't allow us to just say this. We have to say this. And so you end up with the one God in three persons kind of shorthand for a kind of a huge revelation that the Bible's giving to us. And so what difference does it make that God is triune? What difference does it make that God is inherently relational? Like that's huge.
Yeah. And almost goes without saying, but we're saying we don't want to assume things, so it's let's not assume this one either. But Jesus is going to be completely central to this whole conversation, what or to all of these four questions, but particularly this first one is, if you want to know what God is like, then look at Jesus. He's going to be the one that's going to reveal God to us. He's going to be the one that's going to reveal answers really to the other questions too. So, yeah, look at Jesus and have that question at the front of our minds, the front of our lips when we're preaching. Okay, what God is Jesus revealing?
Right. And if people have got the natural human assumption that God is like the headmaster or like the policeman in the sky or like my dad, not just my dad, anyone's dad, if God is like distant or abusive or cold or killjoy or whatever, that's a huge assumption that you're imposing on the Bible when you read God. Oh yeah, the one who's trying to stop us from knowing what life is. It's like, actually, the more you read the Bible, the more you discover God is nothing like that.
Yeah.
There is an element of judgment and holiness and things that might support some of those ideas, but the more we get to know the God of the Bible, the more delightful he becomes to us.
Yeah.
Which means for us as preachers, I'm preaching a book that is inherently the revelation of God. Right? This is God's self-revelation. If he didn't give us this, we would be groping in the dark, making up even more religions. But actually, he has given us in the scriptures a wonderful gift of this is what I'm like. And so I think that's a really good question for us as preachers. When I'm preaching on a Sunday or whenever, how is this passage going to help these people understand what God is like? And how is my preaching going to bring that out? Because often, if we assume, everyone knows what I mean when I say God, what we can end up doing is preaching that just points at people. You've got to try harder. You've got to be better. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. And people go away feeling like it was all about them. Actually, if I was preaching it properly, they would go away thinking about what God's like.
Yeah.
And so how is this passage and this preacher going to help this congregation know the answer to that first question better after this Sunday's message? I think that's a good question we should be asking.
Yeah. So question 2 follows on a little bit from that. So question 1, what is God like? Question 2, what is a human? What does it mean to be human? Probably you've never thought about that question. That's typically my experience. What does it mean to be human? Well, it just kind of means that I am me, and this is my body, and it's a human body, and
this is a human.
This is my I am an exhibit A of what a human is. If we're in God, if we're made in God's image, well, there has to be a connection. There's a theological connection between the two answers.
There is, and also it's continuing on in the sense that just as I have assumptions about God, the Bible is correcting those assumptions. Why? Because my assumptions are not automatically right. That's a very gracious way of putting it. My assumptions are fallen. I'm a fallen creature in a fallen world, and I don't know how fallen I am, which we'll get to in question 3. But what does it mean to be a human? I've got a whole set of assumptions that are based on my fallenness. And so I assume that I'm a free agent who can choose what socks I wear and what snacks I buy and where I go on holiday. And, look at me, aren't I an amazing, fully functioning human? The Bible seems to be crying out to us, page after page, you don't know what it means to be human. You're taking that assumption and you're missing what life really is. When Jesus said, I've come that you may have life to the full, most people say, well, my life's okay. What are you going to add? And it's like, well, no, actually, you don't even know what life is. That whole conversation with Nicodemus, we can't even talk about spiritual life because you ain't got it yet.
Yeah. And
Nicodemus would have put himself as exhibit A of somebody who's spiritually alive. And so, what does it mean to be human? Our assumption is it's this. It's my independent, free-thinking, autonomous, decision-making, functioning humanness.
And what type of humanness does Jesus seem to promote or to bless, to encourage? It's not a humanness that goes around trying to add stuff into your life. It's a relationship thing. Jesus affirms, promotes, blesses relationships, and I think points us to actually pursue relationship with people, because to be human means to be relational, because God is relational. You can see the connection between questions 1 and 2 again, but it just seems to me that Jesus is almost purely relational in who he is, in what he does, in how he reveals what God is like.
That's right. And I think as well, I've noticed when I'm preaching, if I say everything in our world tells us that life consists in being a bigger, better you, more stuff, more knowledge, more success, more influence, improve your CV, your resume, make that the best it can be, and that makes you a more substantial human. And people just nod because that's an absolute given. But then when I say, it's interesting how our greatest joys and our greatest sorrows always come in the context of relationship. I've never had anyone push back on that. I've said that, I don't know, dozens of
Yeah,
times. But it's true. Like I could have, the nicest car in the world, and I would be really bothered if it was scratched. But I'm way more bothered if my child gets scratched, in
yeah,
quotes. Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
if someone hurts my child or hurts my spouse or someone I love, that that gets to me way deeper than anything I could ever own.
yeah.
And it's like there's this clash between our post Genesis 3 way of thinking, which we all affirm, and our Genesis 1 and 2 created design, which we feel at a deep level. Yeah, I am a relator. And that's what hurts, or that's where the joys come. And so, yeah, what does it mean to be human, made in the image of God? And how does the Bible, as you're preaching, again, preaching a passage, what is it saying about humans and how we operate? Because the Bible says a whole lot more about our heart than our culture. Our culture talks about heart in terms of Valentine's Day, but our culture assumes this autonomy, mind, rational, decisive decision-making kind of
Yeah.
humanity.
Controllable.
Controllable, exactly. And the Bible seems to be constantly saying the heart's the issue.
Yeah,
And you can't control your heart. And we're responders rather than responsible. And so it's kind of like letting the Bible poke at our assumptions so that over the course of a lifetime, we're getting clearer and clearer on what it means to be human, so that as we're preaching, we're not only communicating what the text is saying to humans about humanity, but we're pastoring them, we're mentoring them, we're friending them, we're parenting them, we're loving them in a way that kind of makes sense to who they are and what they're designed for. Because if I spend all my time and energy trying to force my children to understand the importance of something and be disciplined enough to do it, but their heart is never won to it, the fruit isn't going to be very good. And we see that in parenting, we see it in pastoring, we see it all over the place. And we think, well, maybe I just need a more sophisticated way of doing it, a better education, a stronger pressure. Well, maybe the issue is our assumption that we think we know what a human is, and we're working towards educating and pressuring when actually they're heart-driven creatures, and we're missing what the Bible's saying. That's kind of what we're getting at, isn't it? Like, let's get down to those foundational questions, and it's not going to fix everything, but it's going to allow us to hopefully communicate and connect and minister in a far more effective way.
it's hard to talk about what is a human without talking about brokenness, and that's the third question: is so what's the problem if God is relational, and if we are made in His image to be relational? Very quickly in the conversation, we feel and we know that that we are broken in so many ways, but particularly kind of relational. So that's so. What is that problem? And you said earlier that even if we sort of Christianize the question that the problem's sin, okay, but still there's still a question. Okay, so what is sin? Is sin the outworking, kind of the sins that are coming out? Is that the problem, or is that merely evidence of a problem? And we would, I think, talk much more about the those outward sins, the things we do wrong, kind of stuff ups, all those kind of things. That's much more sort of the outside evidence of an internal kind of sin problem, because sin is so much worse than we would ever imagine. And again, if without God's word, we wouldn't know. I don't think how serious sin was, because so many places the Bible talks about us humans being spiritually dead. So at the heart level, just dead, no spiritual life, and that is the absolute heart of sin.
Yeah. And what we tend to do is take biblical statements and treat them as if they're almost affirming when they're actually the exact opposite. So, for example, we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Yeah, we don't quite make it. That's not what it says. It says we all fall short. It doesn't say we're all quite close.
Yeah,
And I think there's that assumption that sin is my little faux pas, my oops, I shouldn't have done that. But apart from that, I've had a great week.
yeah,
And the more you study the Bible, the more you're in the Word, the more the Spirit's working in you, the more you realize, whoa, I'm a sinner. I'm fallen. I'm a bigger mess than I realize. And I think often that happens over time, doesn't it? People get saved, convicted of sin, trusting Jesus for salvation. And then some time later, even years later, it's almost like the Holy Spirit shines a light into another darker corner of the basement of your life. And you go, whoa, I'm worse than I realized. And then you bring that to God. And so it's not like you're not saved because there's still sin in the basement of your being. It's like there's a progression of our awareness. But biblically, it's kind of flagging it to us and saying, oh, no, you're not almost good enough. The bad news is way worse than you imagine. It's death, like you said. It's total. It's not partial. It's not slightly. It's not almost. It's no, you're dead. You're guilty. You're bankrupt. You've got nothing to bring to God. Not even your good behavior and your good bits, because even those were done with false motives. And so, yeah, the bad news is bad. And actually, as hard as that is, it's better to know that. It's better to know how big the problem is than to sort of pretend it's not that serious.
yeah. Jesus took in Mark 7 when he said, the murder and adultery and that long list of stuff, like they're bad things to do, but he says that they come from the heart, and so the problem is the heart. And if that was the end of the Gospel of Mark, we'd just be despairing. It's like, well, in that case, I can't do anything. If everything is coming from my heart, I can't do anything. But he talks in Mark and obviously all the other Gospels about, he's come for unrighteous people. He's come for sick people. He's come for people that have dead hearts. And the promise of the gospel in Jesus is a new heart.
And so then when you talk about the problem, it kind of raises a question about the solution. And the question I think that should get raised is, if the problem's worse than we realize, does that cast doubt on the solution? Like, okay, it's really bad. We're in a really bad situation, spiritually speaking. Is God's solution to that problem good enough? Because obviously the human solution isn't like, so our human assumption is I can fix it.
Yeah.
And we still carry that as Christians. Like you point out a problem, okay, I'll try harder. That's a human solution. The gospel doesn't say, okay, if you try hard enough, you'll get in. All right. So what's the solution? It comes from God. It's by his grace. Okay. But is that enough? Is God's grace enough? Is God's solution good enough? Or is my problem so bad that I just should despair? In myself, I should despair, but in him, no, the solution is good enough. And so I think what you end up doing when you work your way down through the 4 questions and face them instead of just assuming things is you end up with a richer view of God, a richer understanding, a more accurate understanding of how humans function, a far more profound sense of sin and sinfulness and how serious the problem is, but then the joy that comes when you discover, wow, the good news is better than I realized. It's not simply a little legal loophole. It's not simply a little thing that God's done. It's a complete solution. And so, you start digging into that. Okay, if the problem is the heart, what's the solution? New heart, law written on the heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. If the problem is my sin and guilt, the solution is forgiveness and atonement, and it's dealt with properly, fully, and the whole thing is so much better than we tend to think. And if my problem is, well, I'm spiritually dead, well, the solution is you get the Spirit of God himself within you. So you end up with a sort of a matching of questions 3 and 4, But the way you get there is one passage at a time. And each Bible passage doesn't necessarily give you answers to all four questions. But I think as preachers, it helps us to keep those four questions in mind, to be kind of constantly churning those over in our minds so that when we come to a passage that we haven't looked at for a while, oh, what does this tell me about God? What does this tell me about humans? What does this tell me about the problem and the solution? That's not my 4 points for my sermon,
Yeah.
but it's in the back of my thinking.
Yeah.
And then as I'm evaluating what I'm communicating to people, am I helping them to see these things more clearly? Because get these answers more clear and you will get the benefit in your life.
Yeah. Because these four questions are underneath everything we do, whether we know them or not.
Right.
So we're trying to bring these foundational things not to the surface, because that doesn't really work kind of building wise, but just they're going to be there whatever we do. So let's know that those four questions are there, and let's try and get to as biblical, Jesus-centered answers to those questions as possible. And you write about all these four questions. Let me hold this book up in a professional style. Foundations by Peter Mead. You talk more about all of these four questions, and we'll talk more about them as we go along in this podcast. They really are just so important. They really inform everything that you and I do, ministry wise, but in church and in life as well.
And what I do in the book, it's a really short book. I'm a big fan of writing short because there's a chance someone might read it. But I think what I really enjoyed about that book is I went back and looked at what the apostles were preaching in the book of Acts. So when they're starting the church, right at the beginning, what are they talking about? And you go, oh, hang on a minute. These are the questions they're addressing. They're answering the God question. They're answering the human question. They're answering the problem solution. And so, it's not like, let's go to the most obscure corner of a minor prophet that we can and pull something out. I think you go back to the speeches in Acts. It's pretty foundational stuff.
Yeah.
But instead of going there, just to finish, a passage that Mike, you and I have kind of come back to a lot, it kind of is an example of the challenge of going after the assumptions, right? So the first question, the most important one, what is God like? Psalm 113. Just share this with you. It's a beautiful psalm, and we'll come back to it again in the future, guaranteed. It's a praise psalm. It talks about praising the Lord. Everyone everywhere should be praising the Lord. Why? Because he's high, he's lifted up, he's above everything, above the nations, his glory is above the heavens. And you kind of go, yeah, this is all very familiar. God is high, he's exalted, he's majestic, he's in charge, and he is worthy of our praise. And then you get to verse 5-6, where it says, who is like the Lord our God, who is seated on high? All right, so who's like him? Kind of the question of the name Micah, like who is like our God? And the answer, no one's like our God. He's high, he's exalted, he's majestic. But then he says, who looks far down, or who stoops down, or even really, I think it should be translated, who humbles himself. And it's almost like the brakes get hit when you read that and realize, wow, this is saying God humbles himself. That doesn't fit. If our assumption is that God is purely majesty, power, glory, greatness, and exaltation, why would he humble himself? Certainly gods of other religions wouldn't. They would never do that, but our God does. And it shouldn't surprise us because we know Jesus and we know where the story goes. And of course he humbles himself. But you see, we can excuse that and we can say, well, that's Jesus on his mission for a brief time in his humanity. And we can come up with all these phrases that discount it. Kind of back to what you said at the start. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This is what God is like. The God who humbles himself for the sake of others. And so as you read Psalm 113, verse 6, allowing that truth to kind of land and maybe recalibrate a little bit of our primary foundational assumptions about God, actually that can be super healthy. It can stir us to worship in a greater way, not because he isn't high and majestic and lifted up. He absolutely is, far more than we grasp. But that God humbles himself. And this is one verse, but we've got a whole Bible where we get to reveal, well, we get to see for ourselves what God is like, discover what he's like, and then as we preach, communicate that to others. What an incredible privilege.
Yeah, we worship, we can delight in a God, not of our wishful thinking, not of our kind of assumptions projected, but a God who really does care and a God who really does come down, humble himself. So we can delight in a God like that and enjoy him in these coming days.
What a God.
There we go.
We should finish there.
Yeah.
I don't think you go anywhere better than that.
No, just thank you for listening.
Yeah.
And we'll be with you next time.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate every positive review, like, share, and comment. And thank you for praying for us. We hope you will join us again next time on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.